The Heskvoren containment bay had 42 feeding stations, and Dr. Mevra had cleared 41 of them in the time it took most veterinary officers to process 10. She moved through the rows with the efficient disinterest of someone who had done this 600 mornings in a row, tapping dosage confirmations on her tablet, checking muzzle seals, adjusting nutrient drip ratios for the exotics in Bay C. The Sarathi spaniels needed their salinity cycled down by half a point. The pair of colic grazing beasts in Pen 19 had developed a fungal patch that required topical treatment and a note to the supply chief about humidity variance. Nothing surprised her anymore. Nothing had surprised her in 2 years of rotation at this station, and she had made peace with that. Competence without wonder. Adequate technique, her old instructors would have said, and she would have agreed. Then feeding station 42 hissed, and the containment field dropped. The alarm was not loud. It was the quiet kind, the two-tone pulse that meant a class 4 or above biological had breached passive restraint. Mevra's crest flattened against her skull before the rational part of her brain had registered the sound. She turned slowly, because fast movements near an unsecured specimen were how veterinary officers became casualty statistics, and looked at the open pen. The creature was sitting on the floor of its enclosure, not pacing, not lunging, not testing the boundaries of the dead field the way a Crescent sandviper or a Tauruk blood bear would have done in the first 3 seconds of freedom. It was sitting, its hind legs folded beneath it, its forelimbs extended forward on the cold metal, its head tilted 11 degrees to the left, looking at her. It was a dog, an earth dog, a Labrador retriever according to the intake manifest she had skimmed that morning and immediately regretted not reading more carefully. 71 standard pounds. Coat, golden cream. Temperament, listed as unknown, which was a bureaucratic way of saying no one at Heskvoren was qualified to assess it. Origin, Deathworld 1 Sol system. Deathworld. Mevra felt the word settle into her thorax like a swallowed stone. She had treated Crescent vipers. She had sutured a Tauruk blood bear's flank while it was still semi-conscious, feeling the rumble of its breathing through her surgical gloves. She had once removed a parasitic cyst from a Dalandri acid jaw without losing more than the outer layer of her left palm pad. Those were difficult procedures. They were dangerous animals, but they were indexed, cataloged, bounded by known behavioral parameters. She had never treated a Deathworld animal. They did not come through Heskvoren Station. They were not supposed to come through Heskvoren Station. The transit charter for this sector was explicit about Class 12 biologicals, specialized carrier vessels only, bonded handler escort at all times, double containment redundancy, and a sedation authorization pre-signed by a xenobiology board. None of which applied to this dog sitting quietly on the floor of Pen 42, looking at her with its head tilted like it was the one conducting the assessment. The dog's tail moved, one slow sweep across the metal floor, then another. Mevra's assistant, technician Pollack, appeared at the end of the corridor at a pace that suggested he had been walking briskly, and intended to continue walking briskly in the opposite direction. His secondary eyes were fully dilated, which in his species was the involuntary equivalent of screaming. The containment matrix failed, he said, which she already knew. The backup is offline. Engineering says the relay coil burned out. They can fabricate a replacement, but it will take 6 hours. He paused. And the handler, the human, was taken to medical 4 hours ago. Acute respiratory episode. Environmental allergen triggered a bronchial cascade. He is sedated and on a ventilator. Which means the animal is unescorted. Which means, Dr. Sohn, that we are technically responsible for a loose Class 12 Deathworld Apex companion with no handler, no secondary containment, no functional backup field, and no one on this station certified, qualified, or remotely willing to approach it. The dog yawned. Its mouth opened wide enough that Mevra could count every tooth, and there were a great many of them, thick and white and spaced along a jaw that the evolutionary pressures of a Class 12 Deathworld had designed for one purpose. Then the mouth closed, and the dog set its chin on its forelimbs and blinked at her with wet brown eyes that conveyed absolutely nothing threatening and absolutely everything patient. It was the most relaxed living organism in the containment bay. That fact should have been reassuring. It was not. Mevra exhaled through her gill slits, a sharp controlled release that fogged in the cold air. "Contact Outpost Veronica. Tell them we need an emergency Deathworld certified handler for transfer." Pollock was already shaking his head, the lateral motion of his neck plates clicking softly. "Veronica is 9 transit stops away. The nearest certified handler on active rotation is at Jorvon Deep. 14 stops. Then we transport the animal to the nearest handler." "We transport." The Deathworld creature. Across 9, potentially 14 transit stops. Through active commercial shipping lanes, customs interdiction at Braylon Crossing, and the Sarathi quarantine checkpoint at Chem 4, which is currently under heightened security protocols due to the territorial dispute with the Dalundri Compact. "Yes. Dr. Sohn, I would like to formally, emphatically, and for the permanent record, register my objection." Noted and logged. She looked at the dog again. It had not moved. Its tail completed another slow sweep, the rhythm of it metronomic, unhurried, a pendulum counting time that only it understood. Something about that rhythm, the calm certainty of it, the patience encoded in the motion made her chest constrict in a way she could not explain and did not appreciate. "Prep a mobile containment crate, medical grade, full atmospheric control, and pull the complete intake manifest. I want to know what this animal eats, what it drinks, what its resting heart rate should be, and what it is capable of doing to us if it decides we qualify as threats." Pollock pulled the manifest and read it aloud in the supply corridor while Mevra prepped the crate. The reading took 4 minutes. By the end of it, his skin had shifted from its usual slate gray to a color Mevra would describe, if pressed, as institutional panic, the gray-white of a bureaucracy confronting something outside its filing system. "The bite force," he said, his voice carefully neutral. 400 Terensai. The jaw pressure exceeds our station's emergency hull breach sealant rating." He scrolled. "The pursuit stamina, it says here that Earth canines can maintain a tracking pace for hours. Hours, Dr. Sohn, not a sprint and collapse. Sustained aerobic pursuit over varied terrain. Their ancestors hunted in coordinated packs, cooperative strategy, role differentiation, flanking maneuvers. They can detect chemical signatures in concentrations of parts per trillion. They hear frequencies we cannot generate with standard equipment." He stopped. His throat membranes pulsed, a physiological stress tell he was usually better at suppressing. "And the bonding behavior is listed as permanent." "Define permanent." "Once an Earth canine bonds with a handler, the attachment is classified as unbreakable by any non-traumatic means. It will wait for the handler, indefinitely. It will refuse food from non-bonded individuals. It will remain at the last known location of the bonded human until retrieved or until biological failure. There are documented cases of Earth dogs maintaining post at a handler's last known departure point for years. The file cites multiple instances." "How many years?" "The longest documented case is a decade. The animal sat at a transit point every day for 10 standard years, waiting for a handler who was not coming back." Mevra stared at the dog. It stared back. Its tail moved once more, that same measured sweep, and she realized with a cold, clinical certainty that settled into her like diagnosis that the animal was not looking at her with patience. It was looking past her. It was looking at the corridor behind her, the one that led through the junction hub, through the main concourse, to the medical wing where its handler lay sedated and breathing through a machine. It knew. Not the route, not the details, but the direction. It knew where its person was, and it was oriented toward that person the way a compass needle orients toward a pole, not by choice but by nature. It was waiting. Mevra turned to Pollock. What else does the manifest say about care requirements? Pollock scrolled with the reluctance of someone reading his own autopsy report. Exercise, daily, minimum 30 minutes of unrestrained movement. Diet, high-protein, species-specific formulation. Socialization, the animal requires sustained interaction with a bonded individual or approved proxy. Prolonged isolation without social contact results in measurable cortisol elevation, digestive disruption, and what the human literature terms grief-adjacent behavioral decline. He looked up. Dr. Sohn, this animal can grieve. Grief is listed as a standard behavioral response for the species. They grieve the way we process atmospheric toxicity. It is a physiological event, not a psychological abstraction. Mevra absorbed this, a predator that grieves, an apex organism that had evolved not just the capacity for attachment but the capacity for suffering when that attachment was disrupted. It was, from an evolutionary standpoint, a stunning vulnerability, and from a behavioral standpoint it explained everything. The waiting, the patience, the slow tail sweep that was not contentment but endurance. The dog was not sitting calmly because it was calm. It was sitting calmly because it had decided that calm was how it would bear the weight of its handler's absence, and it would bear that weight until the weight was lifted or until it could no longer stand. She loaded the mobile containment crate onto a cargo shuttle within the hour. The shuttle was a standard short-haul medical transport, rated for biological cargo up to Class 8, which meant it was technically underrated for what she was putting in it, by a factor that the safety manual would have expressed in red text. The dog walked into the crate without resistance, without coercion, without any of the 17 sedation and restraint protocols the GBR manual specified for Class 12 biological transport. It simply stood when she unsealed the pen, looked at the crate, looked at her, evaluated something she could not name, and walked in. It turned once inside, lay down, and rested its chin on its paws. Pollock watched the entire procedure from behind a blast partition with his tertiary eyes shut. "I will note in the station log that you departed voluntarily," he said. "Note whatever you like. I will also note that you are either the bravest veterinary officer I have served with or the most catastrophically misguided. Note both, accuracy matters." The first transit stop was Colic Minor, a refueling depot bolted to an asteroid that had been mined hollow 3 decades ago and repurposed as a way station. The depot was small, grimy, and staffed by a skeleton crew who processed fuel orders with the enthusiasm of people who had run out of enthusiasm several rotations ago. Mevra left the dog in the crate in the cargo bay while the atmocyclers were recalibrated. She had been gone for perhaps 12 minutes, checking coolant levels at the fuel interface, when the depot supervisor pinged her communicator. "Dr. Sohn, the animal in your cargo bay is vocalizing." "Is it aggressive?" "It is. I believe the appropriate descriptor is whining. It has been producing a sustained low-frequency vocalization since you exited the bay. The sound is carrying through the hull plating. My crew is requesting clarification on whether this constitutes a distress signal, a territorial claim, or the preliminary stage of a predatory activation sequence." Mevra returned to the bay. The dog was pressed against the front grating of the crate, its nose pushed through the narrow gap between bars, its entire body angled toward the door she had walked through 12 minutes ago. The whining stopped the moment it registered her presence. Its tail began to move, not the slow metronomic sweep. Something faster, something with a frequency she had not cataloged yet. She stood there, 3 meters away, feeling entirely inadequate for whatever this was. The creature was a Class 12 Deathworld biological, an apex product of a planet that had engineered predators the way other worlds engineered atmospheric pressure systems, through relentless, grinding, death-mediated selection over billions of years. And it was whining because she had left the room. "It's a proximity response," she told the depot supervisor over comms, keeping her voice professionally flat. The animal becomes distressed when unaccompanied. Standard separation anxiety exacerbated by handler absence. I will remain in visual range for the duration of the servicing. She sat on a cargo crate and worked on her tablet while the atmocyclers were serviced. The dog watched her through the grating the entire time. When she shifted her weight, its head tracked the movement with a precision that suggested it was mapping her body mechanics the way a targeting system maps trajectories. When she coughed, a dry, involuntary rasp caused by the depot's poorly filtered recycled air. It sat upright and tilted its head to that 11-degree angle, the same tilt from the containment bay, as though it was running a diagnostic on her respiratory function and finding the results concerning. I am not your handler, she said aloud, to no one, to the animal, to the cosmic absurdity of sitting on a fuel depot cargo crate talking to a Deathworld predator. I am transporting you. That is the full extent of our professional relationship. The tail swept once. Something about the way it moved, confident, unbothered, certain, suggested the dog disagreed. She filed the departure log for Colic Minor with a brief notation about the vocalization incident and a recommendation that future Class 12 transit protocols include a mandatory accompaniment clause. The depot supervisor countersigned with visible relief, as though the document were a barrier between him and whatever had been making that sound in his cargo bay. The atmocycler technician, a lean colic with a facial scar that suggested a career spent too close to things that should have been in crates, asked Mevra as she reboarded the shuttle whether she was armed. She told him she was not. He looked at the cargo bay door, looked at her and said, "Good luck, doctor," in a tone that carried the weight of a eulogy delivered in advance. Colic Minor to Braylon Crossing was 4 hours of empty transit through a shipping lane so lightly trafficked that the navigation computer maintained a bored standby tone the entire way. Mevra spent 3.5 of those hours reading everything the Galactic Biological Registry had on Earth Canis lupus familiaris. The file was enormous. It was, she discovered with mounting discomfort, the single longest species entry in the entire GBR database, longer than the Toruk blood bear, longer than the Crescent viper, longer than the apex predators of 6 different Deathworlds combined, because the entry was not primarily about the animal's physical threat profile. It was about its behavioral architecture. 14,000 years. That was how long Earth canines had been co-evolving with humans, not domesticated in the way the Sarathi had domesticated their herd grazers, selective breeding for docility, systematic suppression of predatory instinct, the slow, methodical deletion of everything wild. Co-evolved. The dogs had changed the humans, and the humans had changed the dogs, and what had emerged from that 14,000-year entanglement was something the GBR classified, with what Mevra suspected was deliberate academic understatement, as a mutualistic apex bonding symbiosis. The dogs could read human facial expressions with greater accuracy than most non-human sapient species. They could detect illness through scent, cancers, seizures, blood sugar crashes, before the humans themselves showed symptoms. They could identify emotional distress through changes in human sweat composition. They had developed a specific muscle group above their eyes, a muscle that existed in no wild canid, in no wolf, in no ancestor species, purely to produce facial expressions that triggered nurturing and protective responses in human neural architecture. They had evolved to emotionally manipulate the most dangerous species on the most dangerous planet in the surveyed galaxy, and they had done it not through threat or competition or parasitic exploitation, but through something the file kept returning to, kept circling around, kept failing to place in any existing behavioral taxonomy. Loyalty. The word appeared 47 times in the behavioral section alone, Mevra counted. It appeared in subsections on pack behavior, on handler recognition, on separation responses, on terminal vigil patterns, on the phenomenon human researchers called the greeting ritual, the explosive, full-body reunion behavior that Earth canines displayed upon their handlers returned regardless of whether the separation had lasted 5 minutes or 5 years. The intensity of the greeting, the file noted, did not scale with the duration of absence. A dog greeted its person with the same physiological cascade after a 10-minute departure as after a 10-month deployment. The animal's body could not distinguish between temporary and permanent loss. Every separation was, in the neurological architecture of the bond, a small death. Every reunion was a resurrection. Not loyalty as the Heskvoran military command defined it, an obligation enforced by rank structure and the threat of consequence. Not loyalty as the Sarathi trade guilds codified it, a contractual arrangement with negotiated terms, mutual obligations, and explicit exit clauses. Loyalty as a biological absolute. A dog bonded to a human would position itself between its handler and a threat without performing any survival calculation. Would refuse food from alternative providers. Would remain at its handler's last known position through heat, cold, deprivation, and the slow collapse of its own body. Would cross distances that the GBR's migration models classified as irrational. The file documented cases of dogs walking hundreds of kilometers to return to handlers they had been separated from, traversing terrain, weather, and predator territories with a navigational precision that had no adequate physiological explanation. Mevra closed the file. She leaned back in the pilot's seat and looked at the dog through the cockpit's rear observation panel, which gave her a view into the cargo bay. Cooper No, the animal, she did not know its name yet, was lying in the crate with its chin on its paws, eyes half-lidded but still oriented toward the observation panel, toward her, still waiting. Still looking past her, she understood now, toward the direction of Heskvoran, toward the medical wing, toward the person it belonged to with a certainty that made Mevra's own professional certainties feel thin and provisional. Braylen Crossing was a customs interdiction point run by the Sarathi Commercial Authority, an organization whose commitment to procedural thoroughness was legendary among traders and dreaded among everyone else. Mevra had prepared the transit documentation in triplicate, with supplementary biological hazard disclosures, a handler incapacitation affidavit, and the emergency veterinary transfer authorization that she had drafted herself, because no standard form existed for this situation. It did not matter. The customs officer, a Sarathi with 3 ceremonial sashes draped over his uniform, and the disposition of someone who had been pulling double shifts since before the territorial dispute started, took one look at the biological transport manifest and slid his inspection window shut. Class 12, Origin, Sol 3. He said it the way a demolitions expert might say unstable compound. You are requesting passage for a Deathworld organism through Sarathi commercial space. Under emergency medical transfer protocol, the animal's handler is medically incapacitated at Heskvoran. The animal requires delivery to a certified Deathworld handler at Outpost Veronica for interim custody pending handler recovery. Then transport the handler to the animal. The handler is in a medically induced respiratory stabilization cycle. Moving him risks cascade failure. The medical team's assessment is unambiguous. He stays. The customs officer studied her, then angled his scanner toward the cargo bay readout. His expression did not change, but his sash manipulation, a subconscious Sarathi stress behavior, increased. Dr. Sohn, the biological hazard rating on your animal exceeds the hazard rating on the industrial solvents in cargo bay 9 of the freighter that docked 3 hours ago. Those solvents require a hazmat escort. You are requesting that I wave through an organism that is rated more dangerous than a controlled chemical shipment, on the authority of a veterinary transfer form you wrote yourself. The animal is a Labrador retriever. It was bred to retrieve waterfowl. The word retriever is in the breed designation. An accretion sandviper is named for sand. It still dissolves calcium-based skeletal structures on contact. The animal is contained, sedation prepped as a contingency, and under my direct, continuous veterinary supervision. I am requesting expedited transit clearance. Denied. You will hold at Braylon Crossing until a Class 12 escort team can be dispatched from. He consulted his console, scrolling through assignment rosters. Jorvan Deep. Estimated transit time, 6 standard days. 6 days. Held in a docking bay at a customs checkpoint, with a bonded Deathworld animal that had been separated from its handler for going on 20 hours and whose species, according to the most comprehensive behavioral file in the Galactic Registry, would begin to deteriorate psychologically within 72. Mevra looked through the shuttle's external cameras at the dog in the cargo bay. It had stood up when the shuttle's engines powered down. It was pressed against the grating, its nose working, processing the alien chemical signatures of Braylon Crossing's atmosphere, the Sarathi pheromone markers, the industrial filtration residue, the faint traces of 100 species that had passed through this checkpoint. She could see the tension in its shoulders now. Not aggression, not threat posture. The coiled stillness of an animal that had assessed its environment, identified that something was wrong, the absence, the growing distance from its fixed point, and was choosing, with what she could only describe as discipline, to remain calm. She walked to the cargo bay. Every protocol, every training module, every simulation, every line in the GBR told her that approaching an unbonded Class 12 Deathworld organism without handler authorization was grounds for immediate professional censure, possible criminal liability, and the kind of incident report that ended careers. She walked to the crate anyway. She knelt, bringing her face level with the dog's. It looked at her. The wet brown eyes were steady, clear, calm in a way that made her own calm feel performative. The tail did not move. This was not the greeting response she had observed. This was assessment. The dog was reading her, her scent, her posture, her breathing rate, whatever chemical signatures her species emitted under stress, and making a decision. She placed her palm pad against the grating. The dog lowered its head and pressed its nose against her palm through the metal gaps. Its breath was warm, rhythmic, certain. Its nose was cold and slightly damp, and it left a faint mark on her skin that she would not wash off for 3 days, though she would not understand why until much later. "I will get you there," she said. She filed an emergency veterinary override at Braylon Crossing, invoking subsection 7.4 of the Interstellar Animal Welfare Accord, a provision she had never used, had never expected to use, and that she suspected the customs officer had never encountered in his career. The subsection stated that a bonded companion animal separated from its primary handler for more than 48 standard hours without a certified interim bonding agent entered a clinically measurable state of psychological deterioration, elevated cortisol analogs, decreased immune function, behavioral shutdown progressing to refusal of sustenance. The subsection mandated expedited transit for reunion or certified interim care. The customs officer read the provision, consulted his supervisor's supervisor, checked whether the provision had ever been invoked in the Braylon Crossing district. It had not, and cleared the shuttle with a notation that read, "Veterinary override, attending doctor accepts full liability for all consequences." Mevra accepted it. She pressed her crest mark to the waiver, loaded the shuttle, and plotted the transit coordinates for the next waypoint. The next stop was where things got complicated. Sarathi Border Checkpoint Chem 4 was, in principle, identical to Braylon Crossing. A scanning platform, a document verification point, a place where cargo manifests were stamped by officials who wanted to be somewhere else. But Chem 4 had been complicated by the Dalandri territorial dispute. heightened security protocols, mandatory live scan inspections of all biological cargo above Class 6, and the temporary posting of a military xenobiologist whose explicit mandate was to determine whether any organism in transit could be weaponized. The military xenobiologist was a Dolandry named Commander Steck. He was 2.5 meters tall, covered in natural chitin plating that had the dull sheen of armor-grade composite, and possessed of the interpersonal warmth of a detention facility intake processor. He boarded Mevra's shuttle without requesting permission and stood in the cargo bay looking at the crate. "Open it," he said. "I will not." Dr. Sohn, under Sarathi Security Directive 1140, I have authority to conduct live organism inspection of any biological at Class 8 or above transiting this checkpoint. Your cargo is rated Class 12. Open the containment unit. Your directive authorizes visual inspection. It does not authorize breach of containment on a bonded Deathworld companion that has been separated from its handler. Opening that crate without a bonded human present will trigger separation distress, which will escalate to defensive behavioral activation, which will create a security incident requiring more paperwork, more hazmat response, and more interdepartmental review than either of us has the career expectancy to survive. The crate stays sealed. Commander Steck looked at the crate. The dog was standing inside it, and it had been standing since the moment the Dolandry's footsteps echoed through the cargo bay, heavy, armored, carrying the vibration signature of mass and intent. The dog's head was low. Its ears were forward. Its eyes were locked on the Dolandry commander with an expression that the GBR file described, in language so clinical it almost masked the warning, as Calm Alert. Calm Alert was the designation for the state an Earth canine entered when it had identified a potential threat and was determining, with the patient, unhurried precision of 14,000 years of co-evolved predatory judgment, whether that threat required action. The dog was not growling. It was not baring its teeth. It was not tensing to lunge. It was doing something worse. It was looking at Commander Steck the way a surgeon examines a site before making the first incision, measuring, assessing, already knowing where to cut. "The animal appears agitated," Steck said. His chitin plates had shifted a fraction of a centimeter, involuntary, the Dolandry equivalent of a flinch. "The animal appears calm," Mevra said. "That is what should concern you." A silence held. 5 seconds. 10. The dog did not blink. Its breathing did not change. Commander Steck's chitin shifted again. A second involuntary adjustment, his body's defensive architecture responding to something his conscious mind had not yet processed but his predator recognition instincts had. "I will conduct a scanner-only inspection," he said. "The containment unit remains sealed." "Agreed." The scan took 90 seconds. Commander Steck reviewed the biological readout, the bone density, the muscle mass ratio, the cardiovascular efficiency metrics, the neurological processing speed, said nothing, stamped the transit manifest, and walked out of the cargo bay. He did not turn his back to the crate. Mevra noted this. The Dolandry were apex predators on their homeworld, armored, fast, territorial. They did not defer to anything. Commander Steck had not deferred. But he had chosen, with the instinct of one apex organism recognizing another, not to present his unarmored dorsal surface to those brown eyes. 4 more transit stops followed. Fuel depots, a relay station, a commercial junction where Mevra had to argue with a dock manager for 20 minutes about berthing a Class 12 biological in a civilian port. The dog ate twice during the journey, standard protein rations that Mevra had modified based on the GBR's detailed nutritional specifications for Earth canines, adding a calcium supplement and what the file listed as an enrichment component. The enrichment component turned out to be a segment of fibrous braided rope that the animal was meant to chew for jaw exercise and psychological stimulation. She threaded the rope through the crate grating. The dog took it with a gentleness that made her hold her breath. teeth designed to crack bone closing around the offering with a precision that could have severed her fingers and chose not to, and chewed it steadily for 40 minutes, watching her work on her tablet with an expression she initially logged as appetite satisfaction and later revised to contentment. She began talking to it somewhere between Chem 4 and the fuel depot at Orelin. She could not pinpoint the exact moment, which bothered her professional sense of documentation. During the long silent hours of transit, when the shuttle's drive hum was the only sound and the cargo bay felt enormous and empty, she started filling the silence. She told the dog about the feeding rotations at Heskvoren. She described the Toruk blood bear surgery, the weight of the animals breathing through the table, the way its eye had tracked her hands with drowsy suspicion. She told it about the veterinary academy, where she had graduated third in her class and where her senior instructor had written on her final assessment, technically excellent, emotionally distant, would benefit from treating her patients as beings rather than systems. She had kept the assessment. She had taken it as a compliment. The dog listened. It could not understand her words, she knew this, documented it internally with the rigor of someone protecting herself from a conclusion she was not ready to reach. What it was responding to was tone, cadence, the sustained frequency of a voice directed at it without threat, without command, without the sharp edges of authority. When she talked, its ears oriented toward her. When she paused, its ears shifted and something in its posture changed, a slight forward lean, an alertness that she could only interpret as waiting for more. When she resumed, its tail moved. One sweep, two. A feedback loop, and she was participating in it voluntarily. And no section of her training had prepared her for the experience of being listened to by something that could kill her, and was instead choosing, deliberately, to pay attention. At Orelin, the fuel depot manager refused to allow a Class 12 biological onto the station. Not even in a sealed crate, Mevra asked. Especially in a sealed crate, the manager replied. Last month a Crescent Viper breached its sealed crate in Bay 4 and dissolved the flooring in a 2-meter radius. Mevra refueled from the shuttle's external port, a process that took 3 times as long and cost 4 times as much, and required her to stand on the hull in a pressure suit monitoring flow rates, while the depot charged her emergency rate premiums. While the fuel line cycled, she opened the crate. She did not plan to open the crate. She had no authorization to open the crate. The crate was the single physical barrier between a Deathworld apex predator and the interior of an unshielded cargo shuttle occupied by one undersized veterinary officer with no combat training, no sedation equipment within arm's reach, and no handler bond. Opening it was, by any clinical, legal, or common-sense standard, the most irresponsible action a veterinary professional could take short of performing surgery blindfolded. She opened it because the dog had been confined for 19 consecutive hours. Because the GBR stated that Earth canines required periodic movement to maintain musculoskeletal health and psychological equilibrium. Because the animal had pressed its nose against her palm again when she checked the water dispenser, and the cold dampness of it against her skin had felt less like a biological function and more like a question. And because something in the way it looked at her, something steady and undemanding and patient, something that had been looking past her toward its handler for 19 hours and had not once panicked, not once threatened, not once done anything except wait, made her feel that keeping the door closed was the cruelty, and the risk was the lesser wrong. The dog stepped out. It paused at the threshold of the crate, one paw on the deck and 3 still inside, and looked up at her. The look held for 2 full seconds. It was not hesitation. It was acknowledgement. The dog was registering that the door was open, and that the person who had opened it was standing beside it, and that these 2 facts were connected, and that the connection carried weight. Then it stepped fully out. It did not bolt. It did not lunge. It did not scan for exits because it had already cataloged every surface and angle and shadow of the cargo bay from inside the crate continuously for 19 hours. It walked 3 deliberate steps, stretched, a full-body extension that cracked joints and pulled tendons along a frame of muscle that reminded her, viscerally, that this was a predator, a thing built by a world that killed everything it could not optimize. And then it walked to the cargo crate where she had been sitting and leaned against her leg. The weight of it. She had not anticipated the weight. 71 standard pounds of warm, breathing, Deathworld-forged animal pressed against her calf, and she felt it through her uniform, through her skin, through whatever professional barrier she had maintained between herself and the reality that she was alone in a cargo shuttle with this creature, and it had chosen, not been forced, not been commanded, not been bribed. It had chosen to rest its weight against her as though she were a fixed point. As though, in the absence of its person, she would do. She did not move for 20 minutes. The fuel line cycled. The shuttle hummed. The dog breathed against her leg, slow and deep and certain, and at some point she placed her hand on its head and felt the skull beneath the fur, solid, warm, the architecture of a predator, and the ears that shifted under her palm like something settling, and the muscles of the neck that could have powered those jaws through bone, and instead relaxed under her touch, with the absolute trust of something that had decided she was safe. 2 stops before the 6th waypoint, a colic merchant vessel hailed the shuttle on an open channel. Their long-range bioscanner had registered a Class 12 organism traveling in a medical transport without military escort, and the captain wished to confirm that the shuttle was not under duress. Mevra told them she was not. They asked if the organism was secured. She told them it was lying on the cockpit floor chewing a braided toy. There was a long silence on the channel before the merchant captain replied, "Understood. Safe travels, doctor," in a tone that suggested the words safe travels were carrying more weight than they were designed for. At the 6th waypoint, Mevra administered the dog's second feeding, the same modified protein ration with the calcium supplement, served through the crate grating because she had not yet opened it, because the rational part of her brain still had a vote, even if that vote was shrinking. The dog ate with measured attention, chewing each portion completely before accepting the next, its eyes moving between the food and her face in a rhythm she recognized from the GBR's behavioral section, trust verification. The animal was not simply eating. It was confirming with each accepted morsel that the individual providing sustenance was consistent, present, and non-threatening. Each meal was a data point in an ongoing assessment that the dog was conducting with a rigor her academy instructors would have envied. Pollock called from Heskvoren between stops 6 and 7. "The handler is conscious. He is asking about the dog. Tell him the dog is in transit to Veronica for interim handler custody. Tell him the dog is—" She paused. The animal was lying at her feet in the cockpit, where she had moved it after Orlin because the cargo bay's environmental controls were cycling too cold and the cockpit had radiant floor heating. It was asleep. Its paws twitched small jerking movements, rhythmic, as though it were running in whatever landscape its dreaming mind inhabited. The GBR file had an entry for this: Earth Canine's Dream. They processed the day's experiences during sleep, their motor systems partially activating, their breathing shifting to patterns that mirror waking activity. She watched the paws twitch and felt something rearrange inside her chest, something load-bearing, something structural, a wall being removed and replaced with a window. "Tell him the dog is fine," she said. "The handler is requesting specifics. Has it eaten?" "Twice. Protein rations with the calcium supplement and the enrichment rope, both consumed completely. Hydration is maintained." He says the dog's name is Cooper. Cooper, she looked at the sleeping animal. Cooper. It had a name, and the name was plain and ordinary and Terran, and now the animal was no longer a Class 12 biological or a Deathworld specimen or a line item on her transit liability waiver. It was Cooper. It dreamed at her feet. It leaned against her leg. It had walked into a containment crate without sedation, because someone needed it to, and it had decided. In whatever calculus 14,000 years of evolution had built, that compliance was the right move. "Cooper," she said aloud, testing the word. The dog's ears twitched in sleep, a small rotation toward her voice, but it did not wake, and she understood, with the kind of certainty that embarrassed her professional sensibilities, that this was the thing the GBR file could not classify, the thing it circled and kept failing to name with adequate precision. It was not loyalty as contract or loyalty as obligation or loyalty as evolved survival strategy. It was loyalty as faith. The dog believed in its person the way water believes in gravity, not as a choice, not as a calculation, but as an orientation so fundamental that removing it would require rewriting the thing itself. It had been separated from its person and sealed in a metal box and transported across 9 stops by a stranger whose species it had never encountered before, and it had not panicked, had not attacked, had not broken. It had leaned against her leg and gone to sleep. Outpost Veronica materialized on the long-range scanner at hour 39. A cluster of pressurized habitat modules bolted to a mineral-stripped asteroid at the edge of Sarathi jurisdictional space. The certified Deathworld handler was a colic species xenobiologist named Dr. Wren, who had completed a 3-year training residency at a human-run facility on Earth's orbital station, and who greeted Mevra at the docking port with the easy confidence of someone who considered Class 12 biologicals a professional perk rather than a professional hazard. "Where is the animal?" Wren asked, her 4 eyes scanning the shuttle's exterior with practiced efficiency. "In the cockpit." All 4 eyes refocused on Mevra, the cockpit. The cargo bay, environmental controls were insufficient. "You put an uncontained Class 12 Deathworld canine in the cockpit of your shuttle." It was sleeping. The floor heating was better for its joints. Wren stared at her for 3 full seconds, an eternity in colic social interaction, where pauses were measured and significant. Then she walked to the shuttle, entered the cockpit, and looked inside. Cooper was sitting in the co-pilot's seat. He had repositioned himself there during the final approach, selecting the elevated position with the widest sightlines, and was watching the docking port through the forward viewport with his ears up and his head high. When Wren appeared in the cockpit doorway, he looked at her, held her gaze for precisely 2 seconds, long enough to process, not long enough to challenge, and returned his attention to the viewport. "He's scanning for his handler," Wren said, her voice dropping to something quieter, something that carried professional respect and personal recognition. "Every visual contact point that might produce the person he's looking for." "Yes." "How long separated?" 31 hours. Wren exhaled a soft whistle through her anterior spiracles. "That's inside the manageable window, but the curve steepens fast. The human behavioral literature says 72 hours is the threshold for what they call vigil behavior. The animal stops eating, stops responding to environmental stimuli, returns to the last location where it registered its handler's presence and remains there, stationary, waiting. Indefinitely. Until biological systems fail." Mevra looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at the viewport. "I'm not leaving him here," she said, and the words arrived before she had reviewed them for professional appropriateness, before the rational structures of her training had evaluated them against protocol and liability, and the straightforward fact that her job was technically complete. She had transported the animal. She had reached the certified handler. She had fulfilled every requirement of the emergency transfer order. Her obligation was satisfied. Wren tilted her head, a colic gesture of assessment. "You're not certified for Deathworld companion handling." "Then certify me." The standard certification requires 40 hours of supervised handling instruction, a practical skills examination, and a handler bond compatibility assessment administered by a bonded human. How long does the practical take if the handler already knows the animal? Wren studied her, Then she looked at Cooper, then back at Mevra. If there's an existing rapport, 4 hours, maybe less. Start now. Wren certified her in 3 hours and 40 minutes. The practical examination involved approach protocols, vocal command response testing, lead handling, stress indicator recognition, and a feeding exercise that required Mevra to prepare a nutritionally balanced canine meal while maintaining continuous verbal and visual engagement with the animal. Cooper completed every exercise as though he had been waiting for someone to run him through the sequences. He responded to her voice, not to her words, which were Heskvoran syllables he had never heard, but to her tone and her posture and the angle of her hand, the communicative architecture that 14,000 years of coevolution had made universal. He walked beside her without a lead. He sat when she indicated sitting. He remained stationary when she stepped away, watching her with those brown eyes, calm, patient, present. He's interim bonding, Wren said, her voice carrying the particular quality of a scientist observing something that revised her assumptions. The primary bond to the handler remains, that's permanent as the file states, but he's extending his trust radius to include you, provisionally, conditionally. Dr. Sohn, that is extraordinarily unusual. Bonded Earth canines do not extend trust to non-handler individuals on this timeline. The literature documents weeks, months. He has known you for 33 hours. I talked to him, Mevra said, in the shuttle about my work. Wren's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a colic expression of genuine surprise. You talked to a Class 12 Deathworld predator about your work. He seemed interested. Wren issued the interim handler certification. Mevra filed the return transit plan. 9 stops back to Heskvoran, to the medical wing, to the human named Garrett. She still did not know his name, but that would come, who was awake and asking about his dog. The return journey was faster. She knew the waypoints. She knew the customs officers and their filing requirements. She knew that Commander Steck at Chem 4 would stamp her manifest without requesting a crate inspection, because he remembered the way Cooper had looked at him, and because certain lessons embedded themselves the first time. She knew which fuel depots would process a Class 12 shuttle and which would refuse. Cooper rode in the cockpit. He sat in the co-pilot's seat watching the transit static through the viewport, his ears adjusting to the shuttle's vibrations, his head occasionally turning to check on her. When she spoke, he oriented toward her. When she was quiet, he watched the stars. When she ate her ration bar, dry, flavorless, nutritionally adequate in the way that only military-grade food could be, he observed her with an expression she had first catalogued as food interest and now recognized as companionship. He was not watching her eat because he wanted food. He was watching her eat because she was the person in the room, and he was keeping track of her. At the relay station where they had purchased the grazer toys, the same vendor was still at her kiosk. She saw Mevra dock and came to the observation window. Cooper was visible in the cockpit, sitting upright, ears forward, watching the station with the attentive composure of an animal that had learned to track its environment without anxiety. The vendor studied him for a moment and said, "He looks different." "Different how?" "Less watchful. When you came through before, his eyes never stopped moving. Now he watches, but he watches the way something watches from a place of safety. He has settled." Mevra looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at her. His tail moved. She turned back to the vendor and said nothing, because the clinical vocabulary for what the vendor had described was interim bond consolidation, and the non-clinical vocabulary was trust, and neither word felt adequate for the weight of what had happened between a veterinary officer and a Deathworld predator across 9 transit stops, and too many hours of silence filled with her voice and his ears, and the slow accumulation of something neither of them had chosen, and both of them had accepted. She gave him a piece of the ration bar. He took it from her fingers with the same controlled precision she had observed with the rope, teeth engineered for lethal force closing around the morsel with the care of a jeweler handling a setting, and chewed it, swallowed, and licked her fingers once. A single pass of his tongue across her palm, warm, brief, utterly without ceremony. She sat motionless for a full minute afterward, feeling the trace of it on her skin, understanding that she had been given something by a predator and that the gift was freely offered and freely revocable, and that this was what made it matter. Heskvoren Station appeared through the forward viewport at hour 46. Mevra powered down the transit drive, initiated docking protocols, and sat in the pilot's seat looking at Cooper. Cooper was not looking at her. He was looking at the docking port. His tail was moving with a frequency she had never recorded, fast, continuous, his entire hindquarters engaged in the motion. His nose was working rapidly, processing the station's atmospheric signature through the shuttle's air exchange, and his body was oriented toward the port with an intensity that she could feel as a physical pressure in the cockpit, a vibration, a frequency that said the thing he had been waiting for was close and getting closer. She opened the cockpit door. The handler was on the dock. He was a human male, mid-40s, pale from medical confinement, with a respiratory med patch glowing faintly blue on his chest. He was standing, barely, leaning against the dock railing with the concentrated effort of someone whose body had not yet caught up with his will. His eyes were on the shuttle. Cooper passed through the door like something released. One moment the dog was beside her, warm, breathing, present, and the next he was through the opening and down the ramp, 71 pounds of Deathworld engineered muscle moving with frictionless, focused velocity. Not running, exactly. Something more precise. Something targeted. The human dropped to his knees on the dock, and Mevra could not tell whether he went down because the dog hit him, or because his legs gave out, or because going to his knees was the only response his body knew for the thing that was happening. Cooper hit him chest high, and the human's arms closed around the dog, and the dog pressed its head into the human's neck and made sounds that Mevra had no classification for, not whining, not barking, not any vocalization indexed in the GBR. Something older than taxonomy. Something that came from the place where the bond lived. The place 14,000 years of shared evolution had built between two species that the rest of the galaxy classified as predators, and that had become, against every probability the universe could calculate, each other's home. The human looked up. His face was wet. "Thank you," he said, and the words were rough and thick and carried across the dock with the kind of weight that made Mevra's gill slits constrict. "He was well behaved," she said. She stopped. The clinical vocabulary would not come. He was good company. The human laughed, a broken sound, half relief and half something her language did not have a word for. "He's a good boy. Best dog I ever had." Cooper licked the human's face, a thorough and systematic application of tongue to skin that suggested he was conducting his own medical assessment. The human held the dog and did not let go. The dock was quiet. Mevra stood at the top of the shuttle ramp and watched them, and she understood that she was witnessing something her profession could not classify and her training had no protocol for and her species had no analog to, and that this was the thing. This was the loyalty. The dog had not known the human was here, had not known the journey had a destination, had only known that its person existed, and that existence was enough, was everything, was the fixed point around which the entire architecture of the animal's mind was built. She filed the transfer report. She returned to her feeding rotations. 42 stations, same as always. Tapping dosage confirmations, checking muzzle seals, adjusting nutrient ratios. She paused at station 42. The pen was repaired, the containment field restored, the space empty. She placed her palm against the grating where a cold nose had pressed against her skin, and she stood in the silence of something she could not classify and did not need to. 3 weeks later, a notification arrived. The handler, Garrett, his name was, though she had never asked directly, was being transferred to a lower gravity posting for his respiratory recovery. He was leaving Heskvoren with Cooper. Mevra read the notification in her office. She set her tablet on the desk carefully, as though it were fragile. She sat for a long time. When she reached the docking bay, Garrett was loading his kit onto a transport shuttle. Cooper was beside him, off-lead, watching the bay with his ears forward. When Mevra appeared at the far end of the corridor, the dog's head turned. His tail began to move. And then he did something that the GBR documented as statistically improbable for a bonded animal. He left his handler's side. He walked toward her, unhurried, steady, 20 meters of dock plating, and sat at her feet and pressed his head against her leg and stayed there. Garrett watched. His expression shifted through something complicated and arrived at understanding. "He doesn't do that," the human said quietly. "Not with anyone. Not ever." Mevra put her hand on Cooper's head, the skull beneath the fur, the ears shifting under her palm. The warmth that she had carried with her, she realized, for 3 weeks, not in her body but in the space behind her ribs where clinical detachment used to live. "I talked to him," she said, "about my work." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his kit bag and withdrew a folded document, physical paper, the kind humans still used for things that mattered beyond the reach of data loss and system failures. He held it toward her. "Interim bond extension authorization," he said. "I submitted it to the Human Companion Relations Board last week. If you countersign, Cooper is cleared to visit you during scheduled leave rotations." The certified handler designation transfers with the paperwork. Mevra took the document. Her vision blurred, which she attributed to the recycled air and the long shift and the particular quality of dock bay lighting and nothing else. She pressed her crest mark to the paper. Cooper's tail swept the dock plating, slow, measured, certain. The transport's departure log, filed by a dock clerk who had no procedural reason to annotate it but did, contained a single addendum. Class 12 biological departed with handler. Handler reports animal turned twice to observe the veterinary officer on the dock before transport doors sealed. Below that, in a margin note that was technically a violation of logging protocol, veterinary officer remained at dock for 18 minutes after departure. Posture stationary, status, waiting. The next leave rotation was 41 days away. Mevra returned to her stations. 42 pens. Same rounds, same sequence, same efficient precision. But her hand rested an extra moment at station 42, and her crest, flat for 2 years, the crest of someone who had made peace with competence without wonder, was raised. Slightly. Just slightly. In the posture the Heskvoren Behavioral Index classified as anticipation. 41 days, Cooper would come back. She could wait. She had learned how from the best.